Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. This is a story about a moment when the entire world held its breath. In the autumn of 1962, two mighty powers, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, stood on the brink of nuclear war. Yet behind the words Cuban Missile Crisis lies not only the confrontation of missiles and fleets, but also a struggle of characters, fears, hopes, and desperate decisions made in closed offices, smoke-filled halls, and along telephone lines stretched between Moscow and Washington. In this video, we will tell why the USSR decided to secretly deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba, how US intelligence discovered it, and what happened during those tense 13 days when any mistake could have meant the end of everything. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. When in May of 1945 the Second World War ended, the world seemed to find long-awaited relief. The cities of Europe lay in ruins, millions mourned the dead, and it seemed that humankind, having endured the horror of total war, would never allow such a catastrophe again. Yet scarcely had the cannonade of the last battle faded when the outlines of a new confrontation began to appear already at the victors' conferences, first in Yalta, then in Potsdam, where the Allies tried to agree on the post-war order. But behind the polite diplomatic language, one could sense growing tension. On one side stood the United States of America, an industrial giant untouched physically by war, and now the world's creditor. On the other stood the Soviet Union, devastated and bereaved, yet having gained enormous political and military influence in Eastern Europe. The US promoted a liberal model of free market economy, multi-party democracy, and global trade. The USSR offered the socialist path, centralized planning, collective ideology, and a new kind of international relations founded on anti-imperialism. Already in 1947, President Truman's speech proclaimed a doctrine that openly divided the world into free and unfree countries, the latter being those under communist influence. That same year, the Marshall Plan began, the largest economic aid program for war-torn Europe. Its official goal was reconstruction, but in practice it meant geopolitical influence. Any country accepting US aid effectively excluded Soviet interference in its internal affairs. The Soviet Union, in turn, consolidated a buffer zone of loyal socialist states: Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. They formally retained sovereignty, yet their external and internal policies were tightly coordinated with the Kremlin. By the late 1940s, opposition had been repressed, property nationalized, and security services created after the KGB model. Newspapers began speaking of international solidarity against the aggressive West. One of the decisive factors of the new order was the appearance of nuclear weapons. In August of 1945, two American atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This marked not only the end of the Pacific War, but the beginning of a new era, the era of nuclear deterrence. For the next 4 years, the United States remained the only nuclear power, and this fact shaped its tougher diplomacy in the early post-war years. However, in August of 1949, the Soviet Union conducted its first successful atomic bomb test at the Semipalatinsk range. It shocked American intelligence, which had not expected this before the mid-50s. From that moment, the world entered a state of nuclear parity, not in numbers, but in principle. Both sides now possessed weapons of mass destruction. In the early 1950s, the US tested a thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb, hundreds of times more powerful than Hiroshima's. The USSR followed. Its first hydrogen device was tested in August of 1953. Thus began the arms race. Each side sought not only to expand its arsenal, but to demonstrate it through drills, air parades, and strategic doctrines. The military standoff had real consequences. The Korean War, which began in June of 1950, became the first hot conflict of the Cold War. UN and US forces fighting North Korea, backed by China and supplied with Soviet arms. Millions died. Cities were destroyed. The border returned to its pre-war line, proof that catastrophe could engulf the world even without a direct clash between the superpowers. American society quickly absorbed a spirit of fear. Schools held regular nuclear attack drills. Children hid under desks at warning signals. Families built backyard shelters. Survival manuals were sold everywhere. Cinema showed plots of total war, spies, and traitors. Senator Joseph McCarthy launched his campaign against communist influence, and thousands, scientists, actors, journalists, faced interrogations, dismissals, and public ostracism. In the Soviet Union, the response was different, yet equally anxious. Power was concentrated in the party apparatus, and the image of the enemy was shaped through ideology. Lectures, films, newspapers, posters. American imperialism was depicted as the source of all world evils. From the late 1940s, Soviet cities built anti-atomic shelters and civil defense systems. Even school children received basic military education. Against this backdrop, Latin America, and especially Cuba, remained a zone of exclusive US influence. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed in the first half of the 19th century, forbade European interference in the Western Hemisphere, and by the 20th century, it was extended to communist powers as well. Cuba, lying so close to Florida, had special importance, geographical and symbolic alike. Washington viewed the island as an economic and political satellite. President Batista, in power during the 1950s, was a reliable partner. American corporations controlled up to 80% of the sugar industry. Havana's hotels and casinos belonged to Chicago and Miami mafias, while the local population remained poor and voiceless. But deep inside the island, another story was beginning, one of discontent, rebellion, and resistance, which would soon change the map of the Caribbean and bring the world to the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. For now, in the late 1950s, the island still seemed to Washington a stable ally, and few in the White House could imagine that within just a few years, Soviet missiles would stand on its shores. By the mid-1950s, Cuba was a land of contrasts. Along Havana's seaside boulevards, American cars rolled past neon hotel signs, jazz-filled casinos where tourists from Miami played poker and sipping rum. Yet beyond the capital's facades lay another Cuba, a land of impoverished peasants, half-starved workers, abandoned villages, and monopolies completely dependent on foreign capital. In March of 1952, without elections and backed by the army, power on the island was seized by Fulgencio Batista. He had already once been president, but now returned as a dictator. Parliament was dissolved, the Constitution repealed, political police gained unlimited power, and U.S. corporations received guarantees for their assets. Washington did not protest. Stability mattered most, and Batista provided it. In these conditions, youth resistance groups began to form. One man who dared open protest was a 30-year-old lawyer named Fidel Castro. Passionate about Latin American liberation history, he dreamed of a new Cuba, free from dictatorship and foreign control. In July of 1953, on the birthday of national hero José Martí, a group of more than 100 armed rebels led by Castro attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault was poorly prepared. The fighters got lost at night, the plan collapsed, and many were killed or captured. Castro himself was taken prisoner. At his trial, he delivered a fiery speech outlining his vision of a just Cuba. He ended with the words, "History will absolve me." The court sentenced him to 15 years in prison, but after less than 2 years, under political amnesty, he was freed. After his release, Castro went to Mexico, where with his brother Raúl, he prepared a new revolution. There, he met a young Argentine doctor, Ernesto Guevara, later known as Che. Their conversations in Mexico's cafes and cheap rented rooms and during jungle drills became the beginning of a union that would change Cuba's destiny. In December of 1956, a yacht named Grandma left a Mexican port with 82 rebels aboard. After several days at sea, they landed on Cuba's swampy eastern coast. The landing failed. They lost their bearings, came under fire, and were almost wiped out. Only about 20 survived, and just 12, including Fidel, Raúl, Che, and Camilo Cienfuegos, reached the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From there began the real revolutionary struggle, first for survival, then for raids, and finally for support from peasants and underground networks. Over 2 years, the rebels slowly expanded their influence. Batista's repression only fueled public anger. Executions, torture, disappearances, and famine drove people to the mountains. On the night of January 1st, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. By morning, rebel columns entered Havana. People greeted them with flowers, tears, and applause. The era of revolution had begun. Fidel Castro did not immediately become head of state, but by February that year he took the post of prime minister and soon concentrated all power. His speeches were broadcast on radio and television. He appeared daily before crowds, traveled the country, listened to complaints, and promised change. And change came. Land reform, literacy campaigns, free healthcare, closure of casinos, banning of prostitution, all accompanied by the dismantling of old institutions, the expulsion of the bourgeoisie, and the nationalization of major industries, including American ones, oil terminals, sugar plants, and telecom companies. At first, the U.S. administration watched cautiously. President Dwight Eisenhower hesitated to sever ties. But in 1960, the U.S. imposed an embargo on Cuban sugar, its main export. It was a harsh economic blow, and Castro responded by nationalizing all American property. Counter-revolutionary uprisings erupted but were swiftly suppressed, while the immigration of the Cuban elite to Miami became a flood. At this critical moment, the Soviet Union began drawing closer to Havana. The first trade agreements were signed at the end of 1960, sugar in exchange for Soviet oil, machinery, and medicine. Soon came military accords as well. Fidel's May Day speech of 1961 marked a turning point. He openly declared the socialist character of the revolution. It was no longer just a national uprising. It was an ideological challenge to the United States in its own sphere of influence. Washington reacted swiftly. The new president, John F. Kennedy, inaugurated in January of that year, inherited from his predecessors a secret plan to overthrow Castro. The Central Intelligence Agency trained a brigade of about 1,400 Cuban exiles to land in the Bay of Pigs, seize a foothold, and spark an uprising. In April of 1961, the operation began. But the calculations proved wrong. Locals did not support the invasion. The Cuban army was better organized and highly motivated. Within 3 days, almost all invaders were killed or captured. Kennedy was shaken. The failure became an international scandal. The U.S. had not only lost a battle, it had revealed weakness, while Castro showed strength. He used the moment to draw fully closer to the USSR. The captured fighters were exchanged for food and medicine, and on television Castro declared that Cuba would never again be a colony. From that moment, the island entered firmly into the Soviet orbit. In Washington, new ways were sought to strike Cuba, economically, politically, or militarily. But in the Kremlin, an answer was already being prepared, an operation that would change the world map forever and bring the planet to the brink of nuclear war. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Cuba became the symbol of defiance against American influence in the Western Hemisphere. In the Soviet Union, it was clear that the U.S. would not stop trying to overthrow Fidel Castro's revolutionary government. And though Cuba was not a formal member of the Warsaw Pact, its rhetoric, its policies, and its alliance with Moscow turned it into socialism's forward post in Latin America. Fidel sent anxious letters to the Kremlin. Cuban intelligence observed suspicious U.S. activity suggesting another invasion. The burden of Cuba's defense now partly fell on Moscow. In the quiet offices of the Old Square, Soviet leaders discussed a step once considered unthinkable. In the spring of 1962, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev proposed an idea his aides first met with alarm: to deploy Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. To Khrushchev, this solved several problems at once. First, it countered U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy that threatened the USSR's western regions. Second, it strengthened Cuba's defense and survival prospects. Third, it showed the world, especially new nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that the Soviet Union could truly protect its allies. Thus was born Operation Anadyr, a top-secret campaign disguised even by name. Anadyr is a city in far northeastern Chukotka, near the Bering Strait. The name itself was part of the deception. The operation included shipping R-12 missiles with a range of up to 2,000 kilometers, along with air defense units, Marines, anti-aircraft artillery, MiG fighters, command centers, and full infrastructure. The total number of Soviet troops was planned at about 42,000. Command was entrusted to Army General Isa Alexandrovich Pliev, a seasoned commander and hero of the Great Patriotic War. He acted swiftly and decisively, appointed head of the entire Cuban grouping. Transport began in the summer of 1962. Civilian ships under neutral flags carried the cargo. Officers and soldiers traveled in civilian clothes with false papers. They were told their destination only after leaving open sea, when captains opened sealed envelopes and set course for Cuba. Unloading took place at the ports of Mariel and Casilda, mostly at night, equipment covered with tarps, guarded by Soviet and Cuban troops often without insignia. Locals knew almost nothing. Moscow's diplomats assured the West it was sending only economic and technical aid. Besides ballistic missiles came short-range rockets, armored vehicles, multiple rocket launchers, and radar stations. Launch sites, bunkers, and ammunition depots were built. Some areas were disguised as farms. Hangars looked like barns, and camouflage nets covered positions from aerial photography. By mid-September, around 11,000 Soviet personnel were already in Cuba. Work went on under extreme heat, humidity, and tropical rains. Builders labored in shifts day and night. Engineers slept in tents. Machinery was buried for concealment. Airstrips were built to host bombers. For Khrushchev, this was not only military, but political. After the Berlin crisis, he felt the U.S. had grown overconfident. He wanted to show, especially to Kennedy, that Moscow could act sharply and unexpectedly. If the missiles could be installed and made combat-ready before discovery, he could negotiate from strength, demand removal of American missiles from Turkey, ensure Cuba's safety, and boost Soviet prestige in Latin America. Yet even inside the Soviet leadership, doubts persisted. Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko warned of grave risks, but the final decision was Khrushchev's, and he made it. Diplomatically, Moscow kept insisting its aid to Cuba was purely defensive. Pravda and Izvestia ran stories about tractor drivers, doctors, and teachers helping the brotherly people. Western journalists visiting Havana were shown schools and factories. Still, disturbing signals reached Washington. Reports from Cuban exiles, Allied government's notes, and unclear aerial photos. The Kennedy administration hesitated. Proof was lacking, and Khrushchev's private assurances denied any offensive weapons on the island. By early October, R-12 missiles were already in place, some fully assembled and launch-ready. Air defense infrastructure was nearly complete. Had the U.S. delayed just a few more weeks, the strategic balance of the world would have shifted irreversibly. But soon a reconnaissance plane would appear over Cuba, and the black and white photographs it brought back would make the entire world stop breathing. On the morning of the 14th of October, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft of the U.S. Air Force took off from an airbase in the country's south. Its pilot was Major Richard Heiser, an experienced officer specializing in high-altitude reconnaissance. Equipped with powerful photographic equipment, the aircraft flew at an altitude of more than 20 kilometers and made several passes over western Cuba, in the province of Pinar del Rio. After landing, the exposed film was immediately delivered to the CIA's Analytical Center in Langley, Virginia. There, in a specially secured room, photo interpretation experts, among them Art Lundahl, one of the agency's leading specialists, began a frame-by-frame analysis of the material. Within hours, they noticed rectangular pads with distinctive semicircular ends. These could only be launchers for medium-range missiles. Nearby, shadowed outlines of transport vehicles, shelters, and service facilities were visible. Everything indicated that positions for R-12 missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads were being built in Cuba. The next day, the 15th of October, the information was handed to CIA Director John McCone, who, without waiting for further clarification, immediately contacted the President's National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy. They discussed initial steps and agreed on the main point. The President must be informed as soon as possible. On the 16th of October, at about 8 o'clock in the morning, Bundy entered the Oval Office. John Kennedy was drinking coffee and reviewing the morning's materials. Hearing that Soviet missiles had been discovered in Cuba, he set the papers aside and listened in silence. Before him on the desk lay clear photographs, long shadows cast by launchers, hangars, and roads cutting through the jungle. It was clear these were not defensive installations. This was offensive nuclear weaponry. The President rose, paced the room, then called for his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was serving as Attorney General. In a small circle, they discussed immediate actions. An internal advisory body was needed, one that could rapidly form recommendations when the clock was now counting in hours. Thus, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council was formed. In documents and correspondence, it was designated as EXCOM. It included Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, CIA, Director John McCone, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Advisor McGeorge Bundy, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor, and several senior officers. The first meeting took place that same day, the 16th of October, in a specially isolated room in the White House. The President directed that no one outside the room should know what was being discussed. The press office continued to work as usual, but behind closed doors negotiations began on which the fate of the world depended. From the outset, two camps emerged within EXCOM. One, the military, was represented by General Curtis LeMay, known for his hardline stance since the Second World War. He insisted on an immediate massive strike against all identified sites. He believed the United States could not afford to wait, or else the missiles would be brought to full readiness. The second camp, the civilian, was led by Robert McNamara, an experienced manager and analyst who pressed for a politically and legally grounded blockade. He proposed imposing a naval isolation of Cuba, which, to avoid the term blockade, would be called a quarantine. Listening to both sides, Kennedy increasingly leaned toward McNamara's position. He understood that a sudden airstrike, however precise, would cost Soviet lives, provoke international condemnation, and, most importantly, could trigger a retaliatory move against Berlin or other sensitive points. Yet no one could guarantee that the USSR would not perceive even a quarantine as an act of war. Strike or no strike, danger remained either way. On the 17th of October, lawyers arrived at the White House to prepare a draft presidential address to the nation and to lay out the legal basis for the coming actions. At the same time, Robert Kennedy began preliminary consultations with the ambassadors of the United Kingdom and France. On the 18th of October, one of the most theatrical scenes of the crisis unfolded in the White House. Kennedy received Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. The conversation was polite but coldly tense. Gromyko assured him that only defensive forces were present in Cuba, Soviet specialists, doctors, and engineers, and that the Soviet Union was not deploying weapons that threatened the United States. Kennedy nodded and smiled politely without revealing that in the next room lay photographs that completely contradicted what had been said. After Gromyko left, the president held another meeting with EXCOM members. There it was finally decided. The United States would choose the path of quarantine, that is, the naval isolation of Cuba, and a demand to halt all shipments related to military construction. In the latter days of October, White House staff, speechwriters, advisors, and editors worked on Kennedy's address to the nation. The president demanded a tone free of hysteria, but firm in resolve. It must not sound like an ultimatum, yet leave no doubt about the United States' readiness to act. He rehearsed the speech several times, rearranged paragraphs, and refined terms. On the morning of the 20th of October, EXCOM held a final conference. Wording was agreed upon. The military received orders to raise the fleet's readiness. Mobilization of reserve units began. Only a few days remained before a potential direct confrontation. In the evening, President Kennedy returned to his residence but did not sleep for a long time. He knew that tomorrow, when he addressed the nation, the world would hear just how close it was to the edge. On the evening of the 22nd of October, 1962, millions of Americans froze before their television screens. At 7 o'clock in the evening Eastern Time, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy addressed the nation with a speech that would enter world history. His voice was even but firm. He announced that the construction of Soviet missile bases had been discovered in Cuba for the deployment of nuclear warheads capable of striking the territory of the United States within mere minutes. The president declared that the United States was establishing a naval quarantine zone, in essence, a blockade, around Cuba to prevent the delivery of new armaments. He further demanded the dismantling of missiles already in place, and stated that any use of nuclear weapons from Cuban territory would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, to be met with an appropriate response. The speech had a shocking effect. Americans rushed to buy food, water, flashlights, batteries, and iodine tablets. Some already had bomb shelters in their basements. Others had only fear. Schools canceled classes. Along the eastern seaboard, calls to municipal services rose sharply. The next day, the 23rd of October, the president's order began to be carried out. More than 50 American ships, destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers put to sea in the Caribbean. They formed a quarantine line 400 miles from Cuba's coast. Every ship bound for the island was ordered to stop for inspection. American pilots patrolled the skies. On each large vessel, rapid response teams stood watch. Orders from Washington forbade firing first, but allowed immediate action in the event of hostile force. On the morning of the 24th of October, radar detected the approach of several Soviet vessels, among them the freighter Alexander Serov, the tanker Bucharest, and the steamship Komsomolets. U.S. Navy Command was ready to halt the ships. The situation was extremely tense. Any clash could lead to open military conflict. By noon, however, word arrived that the Soviet ships had slowed. Some altered course, others stopped. It was the first pause, not a capitulation, but a signal that Moscow was not seeking immediate escalation. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, in the Security Council chamber, a major diplomatic battle unfolded. The Soviet representative, Valerian Zorin, declared that the USSR was providing Cuba only defensive assistance. He accused the United States of aggression, of violating international law, and of using force against an independent state. The American representative, Adlai Stevenson, delivered a speech that became historic. He presented photographs taken by U-2 reconnaissance aircraft showing launchers, storage facilities, fuel tanks, and radar antennas. He demanded that the Soviet representative give a direct answer. Are there missiles in Cuba? Yes or no? Zorin evaded. Stevenson then uttered the line that headlined newspapers. I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that is your decision. He then placed enlarged copies of the photographs on the table. It was a turning point. For the first time, the global public saw visual proof of the Soviet military presence in Cuba. Newspapers around the world the next day ran headlines calling the USSR's behavior hypocritical and dangerous. In Moscow, these accusations were rejected. The Soviet leadership maintained that the missiles existed solely to protect Cuba from American aggression, especially after the previous year's Bay of Pigs invasion. At the same time, intelligence reported to President Kennedy that construction on the Cuban missile sites continued. Work did not stop even for a day. By some estimates, certain missiles might already have been launch-ready. At the White House, ExComm met several times a day. Robert Kennedy negotiated with allies, McNamara worked through scenarios for interdicting ships, and the president sought a solution that would not lead to catastrophe. In Cuba, anxiety reigned. Soviet military personnel pressed on with the work. The missiles near San Cristobal and Remedios were guarded around the clock. Cubans prepared for invasion. Roads were reinforced, trenches dug, and militia units formed. On the 26th of October, a letter from Khrushchev reached Washington. Emotional and personal in tone, stripped of official cliches, it proposed a compromise. The USSR would dismantle the missiles in exchange for a public U.S. guarantee of non-invasion of Cuba. Kennedy saw opportunity in the letter. Yet the very next morning, on the 27th of October, a second letter arrived, far tougher, with an added demand. The United States must not only pledge non-invasion but also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Washington now had two letters, and it was unclear which reflected the Kremlin's real position. It was also unclear whether this was coordinated policy or factional struggle within the Soviet leadership. An answer had to come quickly, but that same day something would happen that would place the world literally on the brink. The morning of Saturday, the 27th of October, 1962, began with the sense that a crisis that had crept step by step toward its limit now loomed over the world like a dense and inexorable shadow. Over the previous 10 days, tension had reached such a pitch that even short White House meetings resembled wartime staff councils more than political consultations. Early that day came the latest intelligence. Construction on Cuba's missile bases continued. CIA analysts believed that at least one battalion of R-12 medium-range missiles had reached technical readiness. That meant that, if ordered, a launch could be carried out within hours. But the most alarming bulletin did not come from the island. At about 11 o'clock in the morning, an emergency message arrived. Over eastern Cuba, an American U-2 had been shot down. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, did not survive. His ejection system activated, but a rupture of the cabin and loss of pressure at an altitude of more than 20 kilometers killed him before he reached the ground. U-2 reconnaissance flights had been routine since the start of the crisis, conducted daily. No one in Washington expected the Soviet side would decide to open fire. Hours later, it became known that the missile that hit the aircraft had been launched by a Soviet air defense crew from the surface-to-air forces deployed near the city of Baines in eastern Cuba. The order to fire had been given at the level of local command. This was more dangerous than any political statement. President Kennedy convened an emergency ExComm session. General Curtis LeMay demanded an immediate retaliatory strike on the launch positions, believing that delay would signal weakness. The president refused. He understood that even a limited attack on Cuba would almost certainly start a war, not only with Cuba, but with the Soviet Union. Around the same time, another incident occurred, less known to the general public, yet no less troubling. A second U-2, based in Alaska, during a flight near the Soviet border, accidentally entered Soviet airspace due to a navigational error. Soviet fighters were scrambled to intercept. The American side sent 2 of its own interceptors, standard high-altitude patrol practice, and they carried nuclear weapons. Conflict was averted almost by chance. The pilots did not open fire, and the U-2 exited into neutral airspace. As these incidents piled up, the president and his brother Robert realized the situation was slipping out of control. Hopes for official channels began to fade. Robert Kennedy then took a step that would later be seen as one of the crisis's pivotal turns. He invited Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to the State Department for an unofficial, intensely candid meeting. The conversation took place in a small office behind closed doors, without a stenographer. Robert spoke for the president. He conveyed that the United States was prepared to offer a public pledge not to invade Cuba if the USSR removed the missiles. Moreover, he said the Kennedy administration was ready in time to withdraw American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but this could not be part of an official deal. It would be too painful and humiliating for NATO allies and for Washington itself. Dobrynin listened without interruption. He asked clarifying questions and took notes, but gave neither yes nor no. He then said he would immediately report the conversation to Moscow. He would later recall that Robert Kennedy showed no diplomatic play-acting, only fatigue and genuine fear. While this meeting took place, Nikita Khrushchev gathered the Presidium of the Central Committee in Moscow. He, too, received alarming updates: the downed aircraft, trouble on the Pacific Front, the naval buildup off Cuba. According to participants, Khrushchev looked worried but composed. He understood that an exit had to be found. That evening, he began dictating a draft message agreeing to dismantle the missiles in exchange for U.S. guarantees. In Washington, the question was which of Khrushchev's 2 letters to answer: the personal one sent on the 26th of October, or the formal one received on the 27th. The first dealt only with Cuba. The second included the demand to remove missiles from Turkey. President Kennedy decided to respond only to the first letter, ignoring the second. The reply had to be immediate. He insisted that it be made public, translated, and transmitted to Moscow without delay. It was a risk, but it preserved a channel and kept a possible agreement from collapsing. That same night, the United States raised its armed forces to maximum readiness short of war, the posture known as DEFCON 2, the second highest of 5 levels. Above it stood only the imminent expectation of a nuclear strike. The world stood on the edge, and no one knew what signal would come from the other side in the morning. But if a step back was possible, it had to be taken now. Otherwise, the next step might be the last. The morning of the 28th of October, 1962, began in Washington with a short phrase relayed by National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy: he agreed. It meant that Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, had accepted the terms put forward by John Kennedy the day before. A world balanced on the edge of nuclear catastrophe had taken a step back. It had begun when, on the 27th of October, the day later called Black Saturday, the United States received 2 letters from Moscow. The first, which had arrived the previous evening, was emotional and personal. Khrushchev proposed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for official guarantees that the United States would not try to overthrow Fidel Castro's government. The second letter arrived less than 24 hours later, written in a different tone. It stated that, in addition to guarantees of Cuba's security, the United States must also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. In the White House, it was understood that answering the second letter could look like yielding under pressure. Therefore, President Kennedy, after long consultations with the Executive Committee, decided to reply officially only to the first message, ignoring the second. The reply was drafted by Kennedy himself with his closest advisors. The letter affirmed that the United States would not invade Cuba, would not attempt to overthrow its government, and would not support any military action against the island. The letter was dispatched immediately, while in parallel the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. At that meeting, held in the State Department building without witnesses or stenographers, Robert Kennedy spoke plainly. The United States was prepared to remove the missiles from Turkey, but only under conditions of complete confidentiality and not immediately, rather within the coming months as part of a long-planned modernization of the nuclear infrastructure. He explained that a public arrangement on this point would ignite a storm within NATO and be perceived as weakness. Dobrynin listened with restraint and promised to convey everything to Moscow. He later confessed that he understood this was no diplomatic ploy, but a genuine attempt to avoid war. He saw a tired, anxious Robert speaking on his brother's behalf, and speaking sincerely. The next day, on the morning of the 28th of October, Moscow time, Soviet radio broadcast Khrushchev's official statement. It announced that the Soviet Union agreed to dismantle and remove from Cuba all missiles stationed there, and to halt construction of facilities related to nuclear weapons. In exchange, the USSR accepted American guarantees of non-invasion of Cuba. The message reached the White House almost instantly. According to advisors, Kennedy, upon receiving the news, simply leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He did not exult. He was simply grateful, not only for the saved agreement, but for the lives of thousands, even millions, spared. Work to formalize the understandings began at once. The United States pledged not to invade Cuba. The USSR began preparing to dismantle the missiles. At Cuba's insistence, UN inspectors were not allowed onto the island, but the process unfolded under observation by American aircraft and satellites. By the middle of November, all Soviet missiles, including launchers and auxiliary equipment, had been loaded onto ships and sent back to Soviet ports. By the end of the month, hundreds of Soviet military specialists, engineers, and soldiers also left the island. As for Turkey, the matter was handled more quietly. In January of 1963, the United States began dismantling Jupiter missiles on Turkish territory. It occurred under the guise of weapons modernization. Strategic parity was now ensured by ballistic missile submarines, and the removal of the Jupiters was not discussed publicly in either the United States or Europe. Thus, a deal was reached that saved the world, though no party received everything it wanted. The Soviet Union avoided war, but gained no equal public recognition. The United States preserved strategic advantage, but was compelled to abandon plans for military intervention in Cuba. Cuba, absent from the negotiating table, felt betrayed. Fidel Castro learned the terms from TASS and Western news agencies. His reaction was extremely harsh. He refused to accept UN inspectors, forbade any on-the-ground observation, and delivered a series of speeches accusing both superpowers of negotiating over Cuba's fate without the Cuban people. Yet the facts spoke for themselves. The missiles were removed, war was averted, and dialogue established. It was a compromise not ideal, but possible. It showed both Washington and Moscow that even amid deep hostility and ideological confrontation, there remained a path to a political solution. Historians would later say that diplomacy won. In truth, caution won. The caution of people who understood the price of error. Common sense prevailed at the very moment when everything around demanded force. Responsibility triumphed, to country and to history. When the roar of political salvos faded and the world slowly drifted back toward fragile balance, the Cuban Missile Crisis, brief, yet almost the final act of human history, left behind not only relief, but a mark so deep that even decades later, humanity keeps returning to those October days as to a lesson written in fire and fear. In the first weeks after the conflict's resolution, Washington and Moscow were gripped by a tense silence, like after a furious quarrel in which no one dares admit how near complete collapse had come. Yet within that silence, the seeds of new mechanisms began to sprout. There emerged the need not only to negotiate, but to build institutions that would keep such a thing from ever happening again. One of the most emblematic symbols of the new era was the direct telephone link between the Kremlin and the White House, nicknamed the Hotline in the American press. It did not exist in October of 1962, and perhaps that very delay in communication, the need to send messages through embassies, diplomats, and intermediaries, created the vacuum in which hawks on both sides felt most at ease. The very idea of instantaneous contact between the leaders of the superpowers proved revolutionary. For the first time in history, there was a mechanism allowing the Presidents of the United States and the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to address one another directly, bypassing the stairways of bureaucracy. The hotline did not prevent every future crisis, but it became a symbol of a shared recognition. In the nuclear age, silence is more dangerous than any words. For Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, the crisis was a turning point. Although the missiles were withdrawn, and the United States promised not to attack the island, perceptions within the Soviet leadership were far more ambiguous. In the months that followed, his authority declined rapidly, especially among the military and the political elite. Many believed he had retreated too readily, without securing clear concessions from Washington. A quiet resistance soon gathered against him, culminating in his removal in October of 1964. For him, it was not only a personal tragedy, but an illustration of how fragile a leader's standing can be in a system where success is measured not only by actions, but by the perception of strength. For John Kennedy, the crisis became a triumph. Though in the opening days the situation seemed dire and even within his administration doubts abounded, his ability to hold the balance between firmness and restraint brought international respect and strengthened his position at home. After the conflict ended, his approval rose, and the image of a calm, resolute leader took root in the public mind. Even decades later, Kennedy would be cited as the statesman who halted steps toward apocalypse at the very brink. His tragic death a year later only deepened the myth of the young president who won the century's most dangerous diplomatic game. Cuba, at the center of the global confrontation, lived a different aftermath. For Fidel Castro, the crisis was a moment of truth. He understood how relative his sovereignty was when decisions about the deployment and dismantling of missiles were made not in Havana, but in Moscow and Washington. Disillusionment with the USSR did not become a rupture, but it shaped a more cautious policy. Cuba strengthened its ideological independence, yet remained economically dependent. At the same time, society on the island grasped that even a small state can become the epicenter of a global drama. Memory of the crisis endured not only in political circles but in culture. Participants, diplomats, officers, and advisors wrote memoirs describing what took place behind closed doors during those anxious days. Among the most notable are the recollections of Robert Kennedy, the president's younger brother and closest advisor, whose perspective conveys not only strategic calculations, but the fear and anxiety that seized the White House. His 13 Days became one of the era's most widely read testimonies. Feature films such as 13 Days, starring Kevin Costner, and documentaries produced decades later returned to the events of October of 1962 with renewed unease. Scholarly works, symposia, and archival analyses help us grasp how precarious the world truly was. Each new turn of international tension, each crisis involving nuclear powers, summons the memory of those days when the world's fate hinged on decisions made within a handful of hours. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a symbol of how close humanity came to self-destruction and how vital it was to step back. It became not only a lesson, but a warning. The world learned that, in the age of nuclear weapons, conflict between superpowers cannot be resolved by force without the risk of destroying all life. Dialogue, diplomacy, and the capacity to listen proved more important than tanks, missiles, or numerical superiority. Perhaps this understanding is the crisis's greatest legacy, the memory that the world can be lost in a single day, but preserved only by daily effort.